Yang. Mimi ni Mchina Mkenya. Napenda Kenya.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Enoch Sikoli and this is the Kenyan Historian. Now, today I have a wonderful lady here. Her name is Miyang. If you love watching TikTok, she's very famous there. Miyang, habari yako?
Sio sana.
Now, when I met her, I had come to do an interview for CGTN Africa.
To Kenya. Mtu akikufanyia kitu nzuri, why don't say thank you? Tukagatia. Ni maaga ya oria wajika. Oria wajika. Noga owe.
Hello and what's up, my beautiful people? It's your girl again, Ivy, and welcome to the Ivy Show. Today I have a...
Meet the Chinese spy winning the hearts and minds of Kenyans. You may or may not have seen this Chinese person. This lady speaks fluent African languages such as Kikuyu, Swahili, and additional languages. And of late, she has been gaining a lot of followers on social media. And she's also gaining a lot of traction in the mainstream media as Kenyans seek to praise and adore her. Kenyans are awed when they see a foreigner speaking any African languages. This impresses them so much because in a slave society, nothing makes a slave happier than the knowledge that the master loves them and approves of them. Therefore, if a Kenyan sees a foreigner speaking any African languages, they are beyond impressed because it means that the foreigner approves of the language, approves, and given the very low self-esteem of the Kenyan population, this simply wows them. And all these foreigners are able to become objects of adoration and are followed around by the media, and they're able to gain attention and fame very, very easily. When she first came into my attention, I started studying all her videos and everything that she was doing, and something struck me. And what struck me was how polished she was. Her poise, the angle that she took, how she stood, how she looked at the camera, how she smiled. And I realized that this is a very highly trained person. I realized that we were not dealing with a civilian. We were dealing with a political, military intelligence agent. In other words, this is a sleeper agent. This is a spy. Her disposition betrayed her training. To the untrained eye, this is just a friendly Chinese woman. But to someone who's well versed in the art of persuasion and propaganda, they can immediately see that this is a highly trained person. Now, which brings about the question, who trained her and why? Because someone had to pay for those classes. Someone had to pay for her to come to Kenya. Someone had to sustain her once she got to Kenya. Now, who would do that and why? She is not acting on her own. Someone is bankrolling this effort at influencing the public. Who could that be and why? A sleeper agent is an agent who has infiltrated a country where they live and work undercover. They work to build trust and gather information that will later on be used to target the host country. Sleeper agents study the target host country's culture for a long time, and they are carefully trained and selected on the basis of friendliness and intelligence and thinking on their feet. And they are implanted in the host country to look as ordinary as possible. They have to give off the appearance of genuine friendliness and authenticity. Therefore, it is clear that this lady is a sleeper agent. She belongs to a military or intelligence bureau. This is obvious because of her posture. Notice the way she walks. Notice the way she stands. Notice the crook of her neck. Notice her eyes. Clearly shows that she's been trained and she has a military background. For the Chinese to take the trouble to implant such a person, and we don't know how many such persons there are in Kenya, for them to take that trouble, there must be an overall agenda. There must be an overall plan that they are working through. Now, what could that plan be? Because she's engaged in social media, we can clearly see that she is working to win hearts and minds. Now, that is a political and military program. Such agents are sent ahead to soften the target. You remember during colonialism, before the British and Europeans invaded Africa, they had already made a decision at the 1884 Berlin Conference. This was not known to majority of the Africans. So immediately after that, the European nations started sending sleeper agents in advance of the military attack. Those agents were called missionaries. They came under the guise of spreading the gospel, but at the same time they were softening the target, mapping out the ground, building up information that would later be fed to the invading armies. They were spies. They were not here to spread the gospel of Jesus. They were here to prepare us for eventual military attack. Today, in the absence of missionaries, the Chinese are sending influencers and trained military and intelligence personnel to soften us in preparation for the eventual military attack. Because every single time you see the vanguard, you must understand that the army is not very far behind. No nation will send spies unless they're preparing for a military attack. In fact, the spy is the evidence that a military attack is in preparation. Therefore, sooner or later, there will be Chinese soldiers on our shores, whether we like it or not. This lady specializes in the political and ideological penetration of the host country. The Chinese have done numerous studies that suggest that Africans are entirely dependent, that Africans cannot make decisions independently and would appear to require external validation from their former colonial masters, which would explain why Africans haven't kicked out European influence even after 60 years of flag independence. They have studied African culture and come to the conclusion that African men cannot make decisions on their own, that they must be held by a foreigner who acts to approve of the decisions being made. Given that is at the heart of African post-colonial political culture, the Chinese have calculated that Africans will be more than willing to replace the European overlords if they can get new overlords, that Africans cannot do without overlords. This phenomenon is what I call coconuts, whereby you have Africans who genuinely believe that they are Europeans and other Africans genuinely believe that they are Arabs. Therefore, it is very, very easy for a third party, a third power, to take advantage and implant itself as the new overlord, as long as the master-servant relationship exists. So what do Africans want out of this relationship? They want free money, they want free things, they do not want to research, they do not want to invent, they do not want to create, they want handouts. It's a culture of handouts. Every single time African presidents go to other countries, they go to beg. Right? So the Chinese figure that it's very easy for them to replace the Europeans and the Arabs in ruling over Africans as long as they are willing to give. And even the smallest amounts of money and resources will get tremendous loyalty from Africans. Given that this is the case, China is saying that it's time that they became the superpower of the world. And so they're taking on the roles, so they're taking over the traditional roles of the Arabs and the Europeans in Africa. And Africans are more than willing to exchange masters, because African men cannot do without a foreign master. And you'll see this phenomenon only in Africa. I want you to notice, any single time they bring it on TV, a cabinet minister, you'll normally see the cabinet minister in a large group of people, or the president in a very large group of people. But inside that group of people, you'll always see an Indian, a Mzungu, or a Chinese. This only happens in Africa. When you look at other countries, when you look at their cabinet ministers, their presidents, you will never see foreigners right there nestled in the upper echelons of power. This only happens in Africa because African men must be controlled by an outsider. They cannot make any decision on their own. So that Indian who is there, that Mzungu is there, that Chinese who is there, that is the real decision maker. African men require that crutch because the Chinese know it. And the Chinese are determined to replace the European, the Arab, and the Indian with themselves. So let's go back to this lady and what she represents. This lady represents a massive effort by the Chinese government at winning hearts and minds in Africa. This is getting done through a massive social media campaign. For those who don't understand, winning hearts and minds is a military strategy. In other words, we are engaged in an active war with China. As part of this influence operation, you'll normally notice on social media, these feel-good stories are meant to make the viewer associate everything good and positive feelings with China. They are meant to elicit a sympathetic response towards China and to humanize the Chinese and to show them as innocent, as friendly, and above all, as harmless. Therefore, you'll see a lot of videos about babies and children apparently doing adult functions in society, appearing to be independent. These are very carefully crafted videos meant to influence people to see the Chinese in a certain light. Therefore, the idea is to disarm us. So this lady is part of that influence operation. You can see the way she's smiling, the way she appears friendly, personable, very likable character. And the idea is to disarm us by gaining over our trust. The Chinese have also studied African culture and understand that storytelling is a very integral part of our culture. We are a storytelling people. Therefore, a trained agent such as this lady is able to use emotional appeals to subjugate the viewing population, because she's able to use storytelling to emotionally connect Africans to the Chinese cause. Observing her very carefully, you will notice that she is using the tried and tested tricks of persuasion and propaganda. According to her training, the agent is supposed to be as relatable and as authentic as possible. This is the reason why she speaks African languages so fluently. They specifically recruited her for her language skills and trained her in the best propaganda methods. Therefore, she comes off as being very genuine, very likable, and very pleasant. You would never associate her with an invasion or the horrors of war, which is what awaits her. Everyone understands in the hearts and minds strategy that you win the heart first and then the mind will follow. This is the reason why she is always smiling, and her smile is very bright. According to their training, they are supposed to show a certain number of teeth when they smile, and at that stage of smiling, it comes off as being genuine, but it is not. As a trained agent, she is supposed to highlight the positive attributes of the coming Chinese invasion and occupation, and she works hard to reframe counter-arguments and alleviate opposition. According to the US Marine Counterinsurgency Field Manual, it carefully lays out steps to defeat an insurgency, on how to defeat a local population by undermining their will to fight and resist. This field manual was updated in 2007 by the senior advisor to the Supreme Commander of US forces occupying Iraq, and it defines winning hearts is persuading the local population their best interests are served by the invaders' success, and winning minds is defined as persuading the local population that resistance is futile and is pointless, that if you win the heart, the mind will follow, that if you convince people that their best interest is also the Chinese interest, then you're well on your way of conquering those people. This is what the Chinese aim to do all over Africa, and this is part of a very large plan of replacing the African population. And we have seen plans by China where they project that up to 1/4 of their population will be living in Africa over the next 50 years, that they actually intentionally intend to replace us. How will they replace all these people in Africa? Through attrition. One of the best ways to do it is through mass sterilizations, through campaigns of chanjo. The other way is to encourage the domestic population to consume plastic food or GMO foods, which will raise the cancer rate and thereby decimate the population, amongst very many other things. However, the Chinese are very careful not to repeat the mistakes that the Europeans made at the end of the 19th century. They do not want to lead the invasion using military troops. They want it to be a gradual increase of the Chinese population welcomed by the Africans. And some of the challenges they're having is the fact that very many Chinese people, ordinary people, hate Africans. And the difference between a trained agent and an ordinary Chinese person is that the trained agent will never show that they dislike Africans because they are trained not to do that. But the ordinary Chinese cannot help themselves but despise Africans. And this is creating numerous setbacks, which is why China is stepping up the sleeper agents in our midst. They are now opening up YouTube videos, YouTube channels, social media accounts, and so on and so forth, in order to counter the narrative that Chinese hate Africans, which they do, of course. The US Marines Counterinsurgency Field Manual also continues to say that the invaders would be best advised to build trusted networks with the local population and build up affection for the invader, and also convert the population to show sympathy with the invasion's goals. In this regard, African affection is regarded as a formidable weapon to be used against Africa in the interest of the Chinese invasion. In other words, they will use our credulity, our naivete, our friendliness against us. They will come first as friendlies and then later on infiltrate the society and then attack it from without, once they have a sufficient number of people on the ground. In other words, once the Chinese population reaches a certain threshold in Africa, they will then have the confidence to launch military attacks in Africa, knowing that a significant proportion of the population of Africa is already Chinese. They also seek to create intermarriages and produce mixed children, because those mixed children will show less loyalty to Africans and more loyalty towards China, and will be a very useful buffer as they seek to replace our population. Therefore, the affections that Africans have for Chinese is considered very, very strong political capital. So will the Chinese succeed in their war on Africa? It would appear that they will succeed, because African men loathe to fight those who they consider to be their masters. As long as Africans worship foreigners, literally as God, because if you go to church right now, you'll find Africans worshipping statues of Europeans. As long as that is the situation, it is very, very difficult for an African to aim a weapon at who he considers to be his natural masters. Africans rarely fight back, even when insulted and humiliated by foreigners within Africa. You will rarely find African governments or African people retaliating against those foreigners. In fact, the president of Kenya was called a monkey by a Chinese man. And the response of this president, a president who controls armies and police forces, was to run and hide in a corner. The Chinese man was not touched. Nothing happened to him. He was able to go scot-free after disrespecting the president of a modern African republic. Most of us would not tolerate someone insulting you to your face. You would slap them. Our president was called a monkey. They did not even slap the Chinese dude. In fact, the government response was to send flowers to England because the Mzungu was sick. And the Chinese know that African men are weak and faithless, and they will take full advantage to infiltrate African countries because they know they will never encounter any resistance. When we were brought up as African boys in Kenya, we were trained on the importance of passivity. We were trained on the importance of non-violence, and above everything, we were trained that foreigners are God. I remember being taken to religious education, and they would show us pictures of Europeans and tell us that these are angels in heaven. They would show us pictures of Europeans and tell us that these are the chosen people of God. I honestly thought they were out of their mind, even as a child. So we were carefully brought up never to fight foreigners, always to bow down and stare at our shoes in the presence of a foreigner. And the Chinese are taking full advantage of this African cowardly behavior. We shall be conquered even before we think. So in conclusion, we can say that China is already engaged in a war of conquest in Africa because they've already sent their advanced parties, as represented by this lady. It is a war of occupation. It is a war for the Chinese living space. China are arguing that they are more intelligent, they are more hardworking, they are more productive, and it doesn't make sense to have all these resources in Africa which remain unused by Africans, that it is better that Africans who are not very productive, not very efficient, and who rarely use their resources for anyone's benefit, it's better to replace such a population with a more productive population that will utilize the resources in Africa for the benefit of everyone. Because Africa is seated upon the most valuable minerals in the world. We have rare earth minerals, we have gold, we have silver, we have uranium, we have cobalt, we have iron, we have every single useful mineral. We have vast quantities of oil, yet all these resources belong to foreigners. In fact, it marvels the Chinese that when any gold mine is discovered in Africa, any oil well, anything that is of value, if it is discovered in Africa, African governments are very quick to hand over such resources to foreigners without resistance. Africans don't even make an attempt to process these minerals and sell them for higher profit. They sell the mineral in the rawest form for the lowest profit. And the Chinese simply can't understand why Africans do that, which is why they are saying that it will be a walkover to take over Africa. That despite having modern weapons, African men can be relied upon not to resist or to fight back, because in fact they want to hand over all the resources. No one has to force Africans to hand over their resources. Africans are more than willing to hand over every single valuable thing within their territories to any foreigner for a mere pittance. My personal assessment is that the Chinese will succeed in creating their new empire in Africa. I cannot imagine a situation whereby Africans would fight back, because if you have grown men who go into a temple and worship a statue of a Mzungu, truly believing that that statue is God, truly believing that Europeans are in heaven, such men cannot be relied upon to fight, because we always say that you cannot turn a slave into a soldier, because a slave doesn't have that warrior spirit. A slave is not trying to fight his master. A slave is trying to obey his master at any point. And so I fear that the Chinese will actually succeed in their takeover of Africa. And this lady will be a very big part of that eventual takeover.